Can you hear me? No, you can hear me. Hello, everyone. Can you tell I'm really good at this? Okay. Good evening. I'm Nicole Willigowan, and I am faculty here in the American Ethnic Studies program. And I want to thank you. Wasn't expecting that to be an applause point, but I'll take it. I just want to thank you all for being here and welcome you guys to a very special event this evening. I'd like to quickly thank those on campus that helped make tonight possible. Can't possibly individually thank everyone, but I do want to call out our sponsoring partners, the Shoreline Community College Foundation, the Waves and Multicultural Centers, and the Office of DEIA. Without their help, so many things would have fallen through the cracks because I'm new at this, and they really helped make tonight possible. So big thank you to all of you. And then in the spirit of acknowledgement, I would love to welcome to the stage Ellie Abraham. She is a Suquamish tribal youth and a student at Chief Kitsap Academy, and she will be sharing with everyone tonight our land acknowledgement. Ellie?
Can you hear me? Okay. Hash lahel, twal Gwalapu di Isha, DCII Chlub, Alila Abraham Seedsta, Sukobs Chad to Al Chad Du Sakwab, Douglas Abraham Teedsta at Teedbad, Palawan Teedbad, Duda Hovish Seedsta at Seeds Koi, Sukob Seeds Koi, Brian Lawrence Seedsta at Seeds Koi, Sukob Seeds Koi. Isaac Abraham Toothsta at Toothsapa, Palawan Toothsapa. Hatsui Abraham Seedsta at Seed Kaya, Palawan Seed Kaya. Joe Ives Sr. At Seed Sapa, Skalan Toothsapa. Barbara Lawrence Seedsta at Seed Kaya, Suquab Seed Kaya. To all of you, you are all my honorable people, relations, and friends. My name is Alila Abraham from the Suquamish tribe. I'm also a member of the Palawan Nation. My father's name is Douglas Abraham of the Palawan Nation. My mother's Lushootseed name is Duda Hobish, meaning blue heron. Her English name is Brianna Lawrence of the Suquamish tribe. My late grandfather's name is Isaac Abraham of the Palawan Nation. My late grandmother's name is Hatsui Abraham of the Palawan Nation. My late grandfather's name was Joe Ives Sr. He was a member of the Skalan Nation. My grandmother's name is Barbara Lawrence of the Suquamish tribe. I'd like to welcome you on this land. This land is shared by many Coast Salish tribes. Shoreline Community College acknowledges that we occupy the ancestral lands of Coast Salish peoples, in particular the Duwamish tribe. We see you, respect your right to sovereignty and self-determination, and are committed to being better listeners, learners, and in lifting Indigenous voices. The college grounds served as a special place for gathering traditional foods in a way that increased the bounty of the land by both Duwamish and Suquamish tribes. The Suquamish used these lands with agreements by the Duwamish, without Duwamish and Suquamish nations protecting and honoring all living and spiritual beings residing in these environments, and the land would not be as bountiful as it is today. We are called to continue that stewardship as we write the next chapter of our college. This is the Shoreline land acknowledgement. What I will be reading next is the Suquamish land acknowledgement. The Sukwab, the place of clear salt water. Suquabsh, the people of clear salt water. The land acknowledgement statement. Every part of the soil is sacred in the estimation of my people. Every hillside, every valley, every plain and grove, has been hollowed by some sad or happy event in these days long vanished. Chief Seattle, 1854. We would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is within the original territory of Suquamish, people of clear salt water, Suquamish people, expert fishermen, canoe builders, and basket weavers. The Suquamish live in harmony with the lands and waterways along with Washington's Central Salish Sea, as they have for thousands of years. Here the Suquamish live and protect the land and waters of their ancestors for future generations, as promised by the Point Elliott Treaty of 1855. Hoyos Chud, I am done now.
I would like to ask everyone present to please reflect on the words that Ellie shared and your own relationship to the land in which you live, you work, and you recreate daily. It's not enough that we just share land acknowledgements. We have to be continually processing what they mean and the actions we can take to actually embody and live them. All right. And now, I have the honor of introducing one of the country's foremost anti-racist writers and educators, Mr. Tim Wise. Mr. Wise is named one of the 25 visionaries who are changing your world, is the author of 9 books, is featured in multiple documentaries, and over the past 25 years has spoken in all 50 states on over 1,500 college and high school campuses, at hundreds of professional and academic conferences, and has trained all levels of corporate, government, and private industry professionals on methods for dismantling racial inequity in their institutions and to provide anti-racism training to educators and administrators nationwide. Perhaps, personally to me, the most important accolade I can offer in introduction is that over the past 15 years, as an instructor across multiple disciplines, I have seen Tim Wise's words change the lives of my students. Through his writings, his lectures, and his films, he has opened the eyes and minds of thousands of them. His advocacy and allyship is second to none, and I'm truly excited to introduce him here tonight. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
Thank you so much for that. It is an honor to be back here at Shoreline. I say back because indeed I think this is the 3rd time that I've been here at least. The first, I looked it up in the faculty lounge just to verify, and it was 28 years ago. It was 1996. A lot has changed in that period, and a lot has not. At the time that I was here before, we were in the middle, you were, as Washingtonians, in the middle of, or at that point at the beginning of a battle that would last about 1.5 to 2 years. People in this state intent on attacking affirmative action programs and equity initiatives, both in employment and contracting and higher education. And here we are 28 years later, and that has most assuredly not changed. Many of the same people, not only in your state, but all across the country, including in my state, now of Tennessee. I was still living in New Orleans at the time I was here then, are doing the same thing. Even though the state of Washington and the state of California and the state of Michigan and the state of Arizona all ended, functionally speaking, race-based affirmative action and the explicit consideration of race in employment and contracting and higher education admissions, we are still having to fight the same battles because there are folks who are still offended at the idea that we ought to do anything to address issues of inequity or indeed to even speak of it. So the more things change, the more they stay the same. One thing that has changed is that now 28 years later, I have not apparently learned how to write my notes in a big enough font to not need these. So I am going to put on reading glasses so I can read my own damn notes, because I'm still writing in a font that would suggest I was 28 years old. I am indeed not 28 years old. Now I can see, I can't see you now, but I can see the words on the page, and that's going to be, I think, probably the important thing. It is a very important discussion that we're going to have this evening, or who am I kidding, a monologue, and then we're going to do a Q&A. It's not really a discussion, but you know what I mean. It's an important conversation that I'm going to have, and to which you're going to listen, and then we're going to do Q&A, and that's when you'll get involved, if that's all right. It's an important discussion, even though the state of Washington is not among those that on a statewide level has sought to eliminate any kind of discussions of race in the schools. My state is one of those, and there are over 20 that have. But even though Washington isn't one of those at the cutting edge of the attack on anti-racist education in schools, we do know that there are communities in this state where these battles have bubbled up at the level of school boards, and there are still teachers who are concerned and intimidated by the prospects of some of these reactionary organizations organizing to take away some of those seats or to take away some of those materials. We also know, of course, that it was indeed the city of Seattle that first came to the attention of Christopher Rufo, who, of course, is from the area and has led this attack on DEI initiatives. He's the one who came across Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative materials and went to the Trump administration to try to ban all of these kinds of discussions at the federal governmental level, and then moved on the next year to attacking K-12 education discussions about racial inequity. So even if the Seattle area is not necessarily at the cutting edge of these bans, these book bans, this sort of curricular cancel culture that we've seen in 20-plus states, and even if Washington State is not among the worst offenders in that regard, you are certainly not off the hook. And it is important for all of us, regardless of what state you're in, to understand the national implications of this movement that we're facing and how we might and must respond. So it is important for us to discuss what is happening nationally, why it is happening now, and why it should concern all of us. First, it is important to note that even though the title of this presentation, as I recall it was presented to me, was something along the lines of the attack on CRT, critical race theory, and anti-racist education, it's important to note that almost none of what's actually happening has anything to do with critical race theory. Right? First of all, for it to be an attack on critical race theory, those launching the attack would have to understand just what the hell critical race theory is. And I promise you that if I were to hold them by their ankles over a bridge, suspended over water, and threaten to drop them if they could not define it precisely within 30 seconds, a lot of folks are getting dropped. Now, I'm not a violent person. I'm not saying that I want to do that. I'm not advocating the doing of it. I'm just saying folks would die if it were up to them to define this thing that they are blaming for all of the world's ills. They couldn't define it if their lives depended upon it, and the thing is, they don't even care. Chris Rufo is on record. On record. See, sometimes these folks hide their intentions, and sometimes they just put their shit on X, right? On Twitter. They just put it out there, and so they don't care. They have no shame. That is also something that's happened in the last 28 years that ought to concern us. It used to be folks at the front. They had to lie about what their intentions were. They had to hide behind good intentions and act as if they had nothing but racial ecumenism in their hearts. But sometimes they just put it out there. Chris Rufo admitted on his Twitter feed just a couple of years ago that the whole point of this was not really to engage with the ideology of critical race theory. It was to use CRT as a brand under which all of what he called those crazy ideas could just be placed. So that anytime anybody read anything that they thought was crazy, they would associate it with this brand of CRT. This is marketing. This is PR. This is not honest, good faith, intellectual engagement with ideas. In fact, Chris Rufo said at a speech at Hillsdale College just a year and a half ago that he, and these are his words, not mine, though they're words I use, and I've already used one twice tonight, he said he didn't give a shit about what critical race theory did and didn't say. It didn't matter to him what the specifics were. All that mattered was bringing to bear the power of this reactionary narrative to discredit any kind of conversations about racism and inequality and systemic injustice at all. They are hoping to discredit all discussion of that. In the schools, in the workplaces, this is the cancel culture about which we should be concerned. Right? The problem is not the canceling of racists for being racist. There are plenty of racists still doing their racist thing, not facing any significant punishment or consequence for doing so. What they are canceling is entire schools of thought, entire reference points, entire discussions banning books. This is not about critical race theory. It's about censoring history. It's about censoring facts. And it begins in 2021 when Chris Rufo decides to use the Seattle materials that he found so offensive to attack any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion training in government. But by 2022, he moved on to K-12 education. Now we have 20 plus states that have limited or banned materials that are quote unquote intended to generate shame or guilt on the basis of race, which sounds good. I don't think we ought to have materials that are intended to instill shame or guilt either, but how does one determine whether there is intent to shame or make someone feel guilty? Because in Chris Rufo's mind, any discussion of historic white supremacy, if we call it that, if we put the word white in front of it, like we can use the word racism because that's generic, but if we actually mention the leading brand name of racism, it's like you can call it cola, but don't call it Coke. Right? So you can say racism perhaps, but you can't say white supremacy because that might give white people a sad. Right? You can't talk about white privilege because that's intended to guilt trip. No, it's not. It's a sociological assessment. And you can either agree with it or disagree with whether it's real. That's fine. We can have that discussion. We can have that debate. Except if Chris Rufo gets his way, we can't have that discussion and we can't have that debate because you won't be allowed to use that terminology in case little Susie Suburb in some 5th grade class gets upset and goes and tells her mom and dad. And then the teachers get in trouble. So they're limiting the ability to talk about those subjects because of the fear that it might make someone feel bad. They don't want us to talk about racism as an embedded systemic force at all. In fact, the state of Florida, in their law, demands that racism must be taught as merely a matter of personal prejudice and as a deviation from an otherwise well-intended norm of equity. That's paraphrasing, but you can look it up. It's pretty close to what they said. They said you can talk about racism, but not as a systemic force. You have to talk about it as an aberration. Right? You can't talk about it as a deliberate force embedded in the country from the start. You have to say that America is this great and good place and racism has been a deviation from our greatness and our goodness. And we're supposed to say that even though history tells us it's not true. How do we know it's not true? You could look up right now the Declaration of Independence, which we hold up as this beautiful, lovely set of sentiments, and you will find the reference to what? Merciless Indian savages. That those who proclaimed the Declaration said that the Crown were trying to stir up against the colonists. Now, if I am beginning in my Declaration of Independence by counterpositioning me and my people with the, as they said, merciless Indian savages, I'm telling you from the beginning that I look at indigenous peoples as inferior and to be extirpated and eliminated, not accommodated in a new nation on grounds of equity. That's not critical race theory telling you that it's embedded from the start. That is the framers of the country themselves and those who proclaim the Declaration saying that. Or you could look at beyond the Declaration, look at the very first substantive piece of legislation that the framers passed. What was it? The first substantive piece of legislation that the first Congress, after the ratification of the Constitution, passed, before they did anything else. Because, the first thing you do is probably the thing you think is most important, right? It makes sense, right? The very first thing you do is the thing you think has the highest priority. What do you think it was? You might guess that it was, making sure the military was on a sound footing, because after all, the Brits might want to come back and have another run. We gotta be ready. We better make sure we got a military. You might think that was the first thing they did. And that would be a good guess, but it would be wrong. There was something they thought was more important. What might it have been? You might say maybe they needed to figure out the taxation system to get revenues. How were they going to raise money for the new country? That too would be an important task that you would think anyone in a new nation would want to take care of real quick. It would be a good guess, but it would be a wrong guess because there's something else that they thought was more important than raising money and defending the new nation from the aggression of the Crown. What do you think it was? It was a thing called the Naturalization Act of 1790. And what did it say? It said all free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens of this new country. Now, if you tell me that that is the first thing that you're going to do, the first piece of substantive legislation that you're going to pass after the Constitution is ratified, you have just told me what your priorities are, and your priority is making real sure that everybody knows who this thing is for and who it is not by God for. You are telling me that it is for white people and white people only. So how is it a controversial statement to say that white supremacy was woven into the country from the start? I didn't say it. Kimberly Crenshaw didn't say it. Angela Davis didn't say it. Derek Bell didn't say it. I mean, we all would say it. But we're not the ones who said it. The first Congress of the United States, those white men said it because they had no shame about it, see? But are we going to be allowed to teach that, or are we just going to skip that? I guess we're just going to skip it if some of these folks have their way, because to talk about that would be to acknowledge that racism is systemic. These folks don't want us to have that conversation, and as a result, right now, not only in those 20 states, but all around the country, there are teachers in school systems all around this nation that have been intimidated, and they're afraid. They don't know what they can teach and what they can't teach. See, the real purpose of these laws isn't even to ban stuff so much as it is to just get people to censor themselves, right? Because if you can scare teachers who already are on shaky ground, right, who already get attacked for everything that they do and the things that they don't do, right? Educators are not the most respected profession, though they ought to be. They're certainly not the best paid. And so you already have teachers that are under attack for all kinds of things. Right? And so now you've got teachers who are afraid if they teach this history book, or they teach this literature book, or they have this book in the library, might they get in trouble? In the state of New Hampshire, the folks there actually set up like a bounty system. They set up a reporting system where they were encouraging parents that if their kids or they were to catch any teacher teaching critical race theory or any aspect of these things I just mentioned, that they could get a $500 reward for turning them in and getting them fired and getting their license yanked. So you've got teachers who are being deliberately intimidated away from talking about difficult subjects for fear that someone might interpret an honest conversation about history as one that is aimed at instilling guilt in white people, right? And so as a result, what have we had? We have had books, children's books, not critical race theory books, not advanced theoretical discussions about systemic injustice, children's books. A children's book about Ruby Bridges, the black child who, now a full-grown woman, but black child at the time who integrated New Orleans public schools in 1960. She's the subject of that famous Norman Rockwell painting, y'all. Can't get more Americana than Norman Rockwell. Norman Rockwell thought it was important enough to put her in one of his paintings. It's the painting with the tomato stains on the wall behind and the N-word scrawled on it. She's being ushered into William Frantz Elementary School by National Guardsmen, right? And a book about her written by her was deemed by Moms for Liberty, that organization that has led the assault on so much of this material in our schools. That book was deemed to be unacceptable for children because it didn't offer redemption for white people. It just told the history the way that, I mean, I guess we're supposed to add a chapter where Ruby gets invited to dinner at the age of 6 or whatever it was by some nice, kindly white people who didn't actually exist at the time in her neighborhood, but they just invited her over for lunch, and now everything's okay. Right? We're just supposed to lie, see, because we can't tell the truth. These same folks have sought to ban books about Martin Luther King Jr. and the Birmingham Children's Campaign. The Civil Rights Campaign of 1963 led mostly by young people, led by children who were hosed down by water cannons, attacked by dogs, beaten by police. But they don't want us to teach that because it gives people the wrong impression about police. It makes people hate cops. See? Or it makes white people feel bad to see all these white people doing all these things to black people. This is what happened, y'all. This is not like somebody's interpretation of history. Right? It's fascinating. Black children never too young to get victimized by white supremacy. White children apparently always too young to learn about it. That's fascinating. Ruby Bridges wasn't too young to get tomatoes hurled at her. Black children in Birmingham were never too young to have dogs turned on them, German shepherds attacking them. Right? But white children, little Susie Suburb, can't learn about it because it might give her a sad. So that's where we are. Right now, it's getting even worse. In 2022, there was a principal in one Indiana school district that sent a letter home with the kids who were white, allowing their white parents to opt out of Black History Month presentations. I want to make sure you're not offended, by Black history. I don't think they let the black children opt out of just like the standard history lessons. No, I don't want to learn about Thomas Jefferson. Thank you. He owns some of my people. Well, you got to sit there. They're not going to let you out, right? But they're going to let white people get out of Black History Month because that's radical. Last month in Florida, one district sent permission slips to parents to allow them in that district to teach a book written by a black author for fear that someone might complain. A black author was too much, so we got to get permission to read black authors. Right? That's what's happening. And whether that is the intentionality of everyone who's on the right, I'm not suggesting that, but that's what's happening. Right? So if that's not what they mean, they need to clarify, because I would suggest until they do, I have no reason not to think that that's what they mean. They don't want any of these conversations, and they are doing their best to make it difficult for schools to know what they are and are not allowed to do. Why? This is, in my estimation, a form of border control. What do I mean by that? We think of border control and border patrolling as that thing that we actually do physically on the southern border of the United States. We don't do it on the northern border, right? We're not really worried about crafty Canadians coming in and taking advantage of our superior health care. We're not worried about that. We're not really worried about that. We don't have Minutemen on boats off the coast of Nova Scotia shooting at, Canadians trying to come across, right? We just worry about that southern border. So we normally think about border control and border patrol as that, like physical, either threats of violence or potential violence or building walls or deporting people or whatever. But I want to suggest there's another kind of border control that some of the same people are engaged in, right? And it's sort of a plan B of border control, right? Plan A is physical removal or physical barriers built at the border to keep certain people out. But the plan B aspect of this, right, is, well, if we can't keep them out, if we can't dictate the terms of the demographics, if we can't keep people from coming, if we can't keep America demographically a white space, right, then at least we're going to control the narrative, right? We're going to control the borders of the story that we allow to be told. We might not be able to keep you out entirely or kick y'all all out, but we will control the story. We will tell you what America is, by God. It'll be our version, not a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial version, religiously pluralistic version, but our version. It is a way to control the narrative, and the people who are doing this are the same people who are engaged in some other pernicious activities that are all of a piece. These are the same people who are pushing voting limitations, trying to make it harder for people to vote in this country. Right? Trying to end things like early voting. Now, why would you end early voting? What's the logic? Is there any evidence at all that anyone has ever presented anywhere at all that early voting is more susceptible to fraud than same-day voting? Of course, it's actually less susceptible to fraud, probably, because you can spread it out over the course of a couple of weeks. It's not as many people coming in. It's not as hard to keep track of. If anything, it's probably harder to cheat if you're voting early. Right? No one's even tried to suggest that voter fraud, that election fraud. First of all, election fraud is just a bullshit concept. Who in the hell is going to try to vote twice, or 3 times, or 5 times, or vote when they're not even a citizen and face deportation and prison? You do realize, like, if you get caught committing voter fraud, it's like thousands of dollars in fine. You go to prison, and if you're undocumented, you're getting kicked out of the country. Who the hell is going to do that just to vote twice? Like, when was the last time an election came down to 1 vote? And if you had just voted twice, your guy would have taken the position. Like, what's the risk? There's like no logic to it. I'm not saying that there's never such a thing as voter fraud. You got a bunch of Republicans down in the villages in Florida that are going and voting for their dead mothers and stuff. Right? Voting on behalf of dead relatives. Voter fraud happens as much on the right as it does on the left, if not more, if you look at those that have really been prosecuted in the last several years. But the idea that this is a massive national problem is absurd. So when they say they want to limit early voting, you have to ask, why is it? It's not because of fraud. It's because we know who takes advantage of early voting. Disproportionately, it's working class people of all races and ethnicities, right, who can't necessarily get off on election day. So they try to go at a time that's more convenient. It's people of color disproportionately use it. It's students who disproportionately use it. And these are all demographic groups that folks on the right figure they can't convince them very much. And so they just want them not to vote at all. The state of North Carolina, when they came up with their voter ID laws, interestingly, what they did was they asked the Attorney General or Secretary of State, I guess it was, to find out what were the kinds of ID that black people were most likely not to have, and that white people were most likely to have. And then they wrote their law to make sure that the thing black people didn't have was the thing you had to have. And the thing that white people almost always had was the thing you had to have. And you couldn't have alternative backup forms of identification. The state of Texas said you couldn't bring a student ID, but you could bring your gun registration license, right? Because that's, you would never fake that. You know, you would never fake a gun registration license. You know, and I got news for you, like, I was a student, I had fake ID, but I didn't get it to vote, y'all. Like, that's, if you're really worried about students using fake ID to vote, you don't know very much about why students want and use fake identification. You need to check in with a young person, right? So why were they doing it? They are doing it for the same reason they want to limit conversations. It's another form of border control. These are the same people, Steve Bannon, you know, Trump's right-hand man, and maybe will be again if he were to be reelected. Steve Bannon is on record saying that we ought to have property ownership requirements to vote. This is stuff nobody would have said 25 years ago in polite company. Wouldn't have said it, right? Would never have articulated. Judson Phillips, who was one of the big Tea Party leaders back in the 2010s, when the Tea Party was a thing, which of course in many ways morphed into the MAGA movement. But Judson Phillips has also said we need property requirements, we need literacy tests. Matt Walsh, who works for Ben Shapiro at Daily Wire, has said the same thing. We need some type of a civics literacy test, which he, if he took it, would fail because the court has already said that's unconstitutional. So Matt needs to be the first one to give up, apparently, his right to vote because he just can't be bothered to Google what the law actually says about that, apparently, right? But that's what these folks are saying now. And they're saying it openly. Ben Shapiro himself, who was considered the smart right-winger, right? He's not the you know, the Proud Boy type. He's not the insurrectionist. He's supposed to be the intellectual conservative, right? And he has openly said on a video by Prager University, which is not a university, it's like a sort of a cheap YouTube knockoff, right? That Prager University video that Ben Shapiro did about the Civil Rights Act, he advocates for the repeal of the Civil Rights Act insofar as it affects private companies. So people on the right now are openly articulating the desire to not just change what we can talk about in schools, not just get rid of affirmative action, not just get rid of DEI efforts, not just make it harder for people of color to vote, but actually repealing one of the key provisions of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 because in their mind it was wrong to tell private businesses they can't discriminate. Because the property rights of business owners are more important than the equal protection rights and the human dignity of actual flesh and blood human beings to be treated equitably. And they're openly articulating this. No one openly said this 25 and 30 and 35 years ago. So something has happened to move us to a place where people feel as though they can articulate that. And of course they articulate that even as they all insist they are following in the footsteps of Dr. King. They all quote him, even as they go about attacking DEI efforts, attacking affirmative action, attacking any effort to bring greater equity. And they quote him from the one line, from the one speech that they ever heard of. Not even the whole speech, just the one line, you know. The one about content of character, not color of skin. They apparently believe Dr. King was a minister who only gave one speech in his life. And then he got shot for saying that, right? Like, nobody's going to shoot a man for saying that thing about the content of character, not the color of skin. There must have been something else. I wonder what it was, right? Keeping in mind that they're quoting Dr. King, acting as if they're in league with the thinking of Dr. King, even as they're trying to repeal some of the greatest accomplishments of the movement of which he was a part, the Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act. What profound level of hypocrisy. See, the problem is, even before this attack on anti-racist education, even before this attack on so-called critical race theory, even before the attack on honest history, we already weren't teaching Dr. King correct, so people don't even realize what's going on. Because for most Americans, that speech in 1963 and that one line is all they've ever heard, too. So when they hear that, it makes sense to them. They don't remember some of the other things Dr. King said, like, for instance, when he said in his last article that was published after his assassination, obviously written before it, but it was published afterward in the pages of Playboy magazine. I only know that because I read it for the articles. That is a joke that only people over 50 are going to get. Written up in the pages of Playboy magazine in early 1969, and therein Dr. King said a lot of things. Among the things he said was that racism was as native to the American soil as pine trees, sagebrush, and buffalo grass. In other words, it wasn't a deviation, it wasn't an aberration, it wasn't a deviation from the norm, it was the norm. It was native to the soil of America as much as pine trees, sagebrush, and buffalo grass. And in 1967, he gave a speech the year before he was assassinated to the American Psychological Association, and this is a part of Dr. King you'll definitely never hear. Let me quote him at length. He said, "Negroes have been oppressed for centuries not merely by bonds of economic and political servitude. The worst aspect of their oppression was their inability to question and defy the fundamental precepts of the larger society. Negroes have been loathed in the past," he said, "to hurl any fundamental challenges because they were coerced and conditioned into thinking within the context of the dominant white ideology. 10 years of struggle have sensitized and opened the Negroes' eyes. For the first time in their history, Negroes have become aware of the deeper causes for the crudity and cruelty that govern white society's responses to their needs. They have discovered that their plight was not a consequence of superficial prejudice, but was systemic." His words, not mine. If it's critical race theory, so be it, but that means Dr. King was a critical race theorist before we had a name for it. Because what he was suggesting is that this superficial idea that racism is just about personal dislike and personal prejudice, which the state of Florida is insisting is what their students have to be taught, is false. Now, are we going to allow for the teaching of the actual Dr. King? Apparently not in the schools in Florida, and I would dare say nowhere else. We weren't teaching that part of Dr. King before. It wouldn't shock me to learn that we're not going to do it now. The point being, the very same people who have always been behind this push to restrict honest reflections on history and repair and reparation for that history are at the forefront of this movement. And they are attempting to limit the vote. They are attempting to end all equity efforts. They are attempting to end honest historical education. Why now? Why now? Because many of us have been doing this for a while. Critical race theory has been around since the early to mid-1980s, so we're almost 40 years, really, since critical race theory begins, and late 80s, it was really starting to pick up some steam within law schools as a school of legal analysis. So we're talking at least 35 to 40 years that critical race theory has been around. Many of us have been doing this work. I've been doing this work for 34 years. And there are many others who have done it for longer than that. Why is it that this particular freakout about what is taught to students in particular is happening now? Why now? Because it didn't happen in 1990 in the same way, or 95, or 2000, or 2005. There were always forms of backlash. But why has it reached this zenith now? I would suggest there are a couple of pretty obvious reasons. One is that this was a response to the uprising of 2020. Right? The realization that we had as many as 23 million, according to some estimates, but even the low-end estimates would put it at maybe 10 or 11 million, but whichever you believe, 10 or 11 or 23, right? That's a lot of people in the streets after the murder of George Floyd. A lot of people, and not just a lot of the usual suspects, a lot of young folks and a lot of young white folks who they didn't expect to be in the streets. See, the system understands, and they sort of expect black and brown folk to raise hell when injustice happens, but they don't expect their white children and their white grandchildren to be out there in solidarity. Millions were. And when you see that, and you have a vested interest in maintaining the system, or you've been doing okay under the system as it is, you can imagine that scares the hell out of some people, right? To see millions of people demanding change, talking about systemic racism, using that term. And so the reason that the freak out is happening now is in response to that uprising and in response to the shifting of the narrative these folks are afraid. Now, on the one hand, we all ought to be very happy about the fact that that narrative had begun to shift. We can't take a victory lap because we're obviously still in the midst of this thing, but let's just understand In that 30 years or so, many of us in this room and others out there have in fact shifted the conversation to the point where concepts like white supremacy are talked about in polite company, and not just the Klan and neo-Nazis, but like white supremacy as a systemic force, white privilege as a systemic force. That term was so verboten that when I was using it in the mid-90s and people were using it in the late 90s, folks would look at you like you were talking a language they'd never heard. Right? And I remember when that started to change, and I knew something was going on. Several years ago, I remember Bill O'Reilly, when he was still relevant. Y'all remember Bill O'Reilly? He's not too relevant now. But when he had his show on Fox, right, I remember him getting on one night, and he had just learned about this concept called white privilege. Right? He just heard about it. And he was incensed. He wanted to make sure everybody knew that it wasn't real, right? So he gets up and he does a whole show about white privilege being a myth. And of course, in order to prove that it's a myth, he tells his own story, which is fascinating because he grew up in Levittown on Long Island. And if you know anything about Levittown and why Levittown was constructed by the builder who created that one and also one in Pennsylvania, why he did it, Levitt, when they asked him what his goal was, he had segregated communities on purpose. He wouldn't let anyone who wasn't white buy in those neighborhoods that he was building. And they asked him why. He said, look, I can either solve the race problem or I can solve the housing problem. I choose to solve the housing problem. So Bill O'Reilly grows up in a community where he has to be white to live there, but he wants you to know white privilege is a myth and it never did nothing for him. And he says this without any irony or misgiving, right? I mean, it's like says this like it's nothing. And then I'm watching it, and I'm getting a nice little chuckle out of it. And what was funny was the next night, he came back on and did a whole second show about how white privilege wasn't real. And that's when I realized something was happening. Because, like, why'd you got to do it twice if you made such a convincing argument the first time? Like, you don't need to do a show twice debunking a concept if that concept has no legs, right? Like if someone had gone into Bill O'Reilly's Fox studio and been like, Bill, there is a Tyrannosaurus Rex rampaging in the middle of Times Square, I don't think he would have had to do 2 shows to prove that that was bullshit. He would have done like 10 minutes, no T-Rex, moving on now. But the fact that he had to do 2 shows about white privilege, he's like, it's almost like he went home and he was like, I don't think I got it. I don't think I did enough to debunk this. I got to try it again. So he did it a second night. That didn't work. Came back a third night, did it again. And that's when I realized, oh, folks had gotten in his head, right? And the activists and the educators and the thinkers who had been pushing these ideas had actually begun to have an effect. And that meant that the narrative was shifting. And in response to that, we should have been expecting Chris Rufo. That was our failure. We should have been expecting it. Maybe we weren't. Maybe we got so excited about the uprising, right? We thought the revolution was just around the corner. You know? Folks said that in 1968 too, I'm told. I was born in 68, but those that are around said, oh yeah, the revolution's coming. Didn't come. Right? So ultimately what ends up happening is the narrative shifts. And what happened is exactly what Carol Anderson, brilliant scholar at Emory who wrote the book White Rage, which I highly recommend, told us would happen. What Carol Anderson says in her book is that every step forward for black folks in particular, but I think you could make this argument for folks of color even more broadly, every step forward for black folks in the history of America has been met with a backlash, a form of white rage, whether it was the end of enslavement, right? Whether it was Reconstruction, which was met with intense white rage, which we don't learn nearly enough about in school. That's one of the reasons we weren't ready for this, because we don't really talk about Reconstruction. We teach history, even in the quote-unquote good schools. We teach history like a linear narrative, right? Things were bad and then they got better. Not realizing things are bad, they get better, then they get bad again. That's what happened when Reconstruction was overthrown. We don't teach it like that. That's why, folks, if you ask people who's the first black Major League Baseball player, and they're going to tell you who, Jackie Robinson, and they're going to be wrong. Because there were black baseball players in the major leagues in the 1800s. They got run out of the major leagues because of a racist player manager named Cap Anson, among others, who didn't want to have to play ball against black players because they hated them so much. So you see, you had progress, and then you had regress, and had to fight for progress again. That's how history actually works. But we're not really taught that, and so we're not ready sometimes for the backlash. Right? We think it's always onward and upward because that's what we've been encouraged to believe, and so we get caught a little bit flat-footed. And what these folks are learning as they attack DEI, as they attack affirmative action, they're going so far now. You heard this like a month ago when that door flew off the Alaska Airlines flight, the Boeing, right? The door just got like sucked out into the air, and And literally, what was the right's argument here? What was their argument? Did they say we needed to maybe think about the way that these things, that this company among other companies is trying to put profits above safety? No, they didn't talk about that. They said it was the fault of DEI efforts because they found a training video where Boeing's talking about wanting to have a program to encourage black folks to fly, right? Really like trying to get more black folks, particularly black women, to become pilots. And that's supposedly why the door flew. Okay, number one, the pilots don't solder the door to the damn plane. Number one. So that just doesn't even make any damn sense, right? You can't blame a program for black pilots for a door flying off. Number two, you can't blame, this is just a stupid argument, right? But this is what they wanted to go with. Well, we have DEI programs, the planes are going to fall out of the sky. Because they're not going to be qualified. I beg to remind you that actually airline safety is considerably better now than it was 20 years ago. Knock on wood, obviously I don't want that to change. I'm just saying, in terms of accidents per hour flown and how many people are in the air, far fewer deaths, even as the industry has become slightly more diverse and as they've done those DEI efforts. Both in regard to women pilots as women and pilots of color as folks of color. So in fact, the argument is the opposite of what they would have us believe. I remember back in the late 90s, early 2000s, after about a 3-month period, it seemed like there had been like 5 stories of white pilots that were too drunk to fly their planes. Right? But we didn't say back then, well, that's it, man, no more white dudes in the cockpit. We need more DEI, clearly. We need black women flying these damn things, not these white guys, because they're all drunk. One of them for Southwest just like got naked in the cockpit and was looking at porn. Drunk. Right? I mean, so standards, people, like standards. What is it? White mediocrity is just like a default position, right? And we can just be mediocre, right? But if you have anything happen in a company that also has a DEI program, well, that's clearly the fault of the DEI program. This is a group of people who literally cannot find a social problem that they can't blame people of color for. Let's just go down the list. You're worried about crime? Well, who does that? Well, you know. White folks think they know, even though white folks are 4.5 to 5 times more likely to be criminally victimized by another white person than by a black person or by anyone of color. We're afraid of black people and people of color. If your kid didn't get into the right college, well, it's obviously because of affirmative action. You may think that excuse won't work any longer because now affirmative action has been outlawed by the court. Don't assume that. Affirmative action's been outlawed in the state of California system since 1996, and I swear to God, every time I go to California, somebody says, my buddy didn't get into Berkeley because of affirmative action. I didn't give the slot to a Latino person. Dude, they haven't had affirmative action in your state since you were in your mother's womb. Right? Had nothing to do with your friend not getting into Berkeley or you not getting into UCLA. Right? So people will still make excuses like that even when the programs don't exist. But that's what you hear. Oh, are your taxes too high? Well, you know it's because we're giving all the money to, right? That's what people think. You don't have a job? Well, it's because an immigrant took your job. By the way, as a side note, I always love that when people say an immigrant took my job. Like, was it your job? Did you have the job yet? Like, did you have it and then they just like took it from you on Tuesday? Like, you had it on Monday and then Tuesday you went into work and they were like, just kidding, we're giving the job to Jose. Is that what happened? Because if you didn't have the job yet, that shit did not belong to you. That's sort of the way I look at it, right? But that's what people will say. Well, I don't have a job and it's because of that. Oh, and if we don't have enough manufacturing jobs in America, you know why that is? That's because China, again, non-white people are undermining us in trade and they're stealing our technology and they're flooding our markets with their goods and with their viruses. My God, see? Every problem has a person of color at the end of the problem to listen to these people speak. There's not a single problem that they won't blame on folks of color except for the ones they blame on LGBTQ folks as LGBTQ folks. They'll do that. But it's always the other, or the Jews. Like, it could be the Jews, they think, right? Some of them will say that. It could be the Jews. So it could be the Jews, it could be LGBTQ, or it could be women as women, but it's always someone typified as the other by patriarchy and sexism and misogyny, or by white supremacy, or by the class system. It's always poor people. It's never the salt of the earth, good people like themselves. And by God, if the planes fall apart, it's because of DEI. The irony of all this is that what we need right now, if we need anything at all, is we need more critical race theory, not less. Right? We need more critical race theory, not less. And if we really understood what critical race theory tries to do for us, maybe we would understand that. Why do I say we need more of it? We need more of it because critical race theory is actually that school of thought which removes this discussion from the whole idea of good people and bad people. Right? It's really ironic to hear white people get upset about critical race theory supposedly being anti-white and making all white people feel bad, because critical race theory, properly understood, doesn't even believe that there is such a thing as white people or black people or any race at all. The whole premise of critical race theory is race is completely fabricated, completely socially constructed for the purpose of maintaining systems of inequality and unfairness. So it's not about individual people called white being bad. That's not part of critical race theory at all. The idea that white people are inherently racist, that is not taught in critical race theory. That is not part of critical race theory. Critical race theory doesn't think people are inherently anything, because we are all products of our social and cultural environment. So if we adopt racist thinking, that's not because we're bad people, it's because we were fed through bad systems, and we need to fix the systems. CRT would actually allow us to take some of the guilt away, see? You don't have to feel guilty if you understand the system is the problem. You just have to get busy trying to fix the damn system. You don't have to beat yourself up about it because it's not on you. As far as guilt, there's a difference between guilt and responsibility. You feel guilty for the stuff you've done, but you can take responsibility because of the kind of person you are. That's what solidarity is. That's what fighting for justice is, right? So we need more of that, not less. We need more because it would actually save our lives. What do I mean by that? That sounds like an awfully hyperbolic statement, but let me prove it to you. One of the most important elements of critical race theory, and a lot of conservative folks really hate it because they think it makes America sound terrible, but I think it's just a matter of truth. One of the key principles of critical race theory that Derek Bell first articulated when he began to develop this as sort of the grandfather of CRT was this notion of interest convergence. And what he said in his work on interest convergence was that if you look at the history of this country, we never have really done the right thing for the right reasons, right? Like sometimes we end up doing the right thing, but it's never because of some moral epiphany, right? Like we didn't get abolition because of some great moral awakening. We had to have a war that 600,000 people died in for that to happen, right? We didn't get rid of segregation because of a great moral epiphany. It was the movement and the pressure brought by the movement, but it was also something else. It was the realization the Supreme Court had when they were asked to decide the Brown decision, which was what? They looked around and keep in mind, they could have ruled against segregation before 1954, and most of that court, they were certainly not anti-racist in their dispensation. But they knew what was going on in the mid-1950s in the world, not just in the United States, but around the world. What was happening? You had an anti-colonial struggle throughout Africa and throughout Asia in particular, right, where you had peoples of color coming out from under the oppressive colonial regimes of European powers, right? And they are looking to the United States in the middle of the Cold War for a model of what they want to be as a country when they come out from colonialism and when they come out as independent nations. And in the United States, you have lawmakers and the court who realize that we need to get rid of this kind of blatant oppression because we'll never be able to appeal to these folks in these countries when they throw off their colonial masters if we're also putting our boot on the neck of people like them. There was an idea that we've got to change our system as a PR thing. Honestly, like it's bad press to continue to oppress the very same kind of people that are overthrowing colonial oppression elsewhere. And so in a way, they probably moved far quicker than their ethics would have dictated to them. And part of the reason the civil rights movement was able to succeed was because we were trying to win a Cold War against the Soviets, right? Trying to show the world that our model was better than that model. And so as a result, we ended up getting some changes, and they were important changes. They were vital changes, but it only happened because of interest convergence. The interest of black people dovetailed in that moment with the interest of the broader white community in America. Now, why is that an important insight in 2024? Well, it's an important insight because we have moments of interest convergence right now that we ought to be talking about. See, it's one thing to talk about fighting white supremacy and racism as a matter of altruism, right? If that were enough, we wouldn't have to have this conversation. If it were enough for folks to just say we should fight white supremacy and racial inequality because it's unjust, we would have had justice by now. It's clearly not enough. But what we do know is that the interest of everyone is really wrapped up with racial equity. How do we know that? Look around. Think about COVID. Right? Think about this pandemic, which of course is still not over. Think about COVID and what has happened in this country in the last 4 years. You know, it was interesting when this thing started. You look at the first couple of months, March and April of 2020. You look at the death numbers, right? And you saw that disproportionately, overwhelmingly, the death totals in those first few months were happening in black communities, indigenous communities, Latinx communities, but especially black communities and indigenous communities, right? And we knew where they were. They were in large metropolitan areas, on the coasts, mostly in places like Chicago and to some extent New Orleans and a few other places, but especially New York and especially the West Coast as well. And only about 28% of the dead early on were white. What message did that send to a lot of white folks? Well, apparently it sent the message that this isn't our problem, right? And so you had people, as soon as that news came out, it didn't come out right away. It was April 7th that the New York Times and the Washington Post ran front page stories talking about the racially disproportionate death rates for black and brown peoples. And almost immediately you had white folks starting to show up at state capitals with guns and camouflage, demanding the right to go back to work, demanding the right to go back to Olive Garden, demanding the right to get their hair cut or go bowling or whatever it is they wanted to do. Because by God, we got to get back to work. Right? And it was interesting, like Tucker Carlson was one of the few right-wing talk show hosts who early on had been taking COVID seriously. A lot of them weren't, but he was. He was actually saying, hey, this is not like the flu. This is way more serious than the flu. We need to take it seriously. And then that New York Times article broke on April 7th. And literally that night on his program, he says, well, obviously the most important thing now is to get everybody back to work. So he finds out that black and brown folks are doing the dying, and it's like, oh, can we just go back to normal, right? And Britt Hume was on his show that night, and Britt Hume said the same thing, said that we've obviously overblown this problem. Literally the night before he's taking it seriously, the news comes out as black and brown folk dying, no harm, no foul. People start showing up demanding the right to open everything back up. They don't want a mask anymore. They'll tell you that standing 6 feet away from somebody at the Trader Joe's is tyranny. Right? Which, if that's what you think tyranny is, you just, like, if you're trying to convince me that white privilege is not real, that's not the way to do it. Telling me that standing 6 feet away from someone in a supermarket is oppression is the best way to tell me that you have never faced oppression, ever, right? And if you liken it to being sent to, Sobibor or something, it's really not convincing, right? But that's what they were doing, because all of a sudden they thought it's not our problem. But here's the irony, and this gets to the interest convergence thesis, right? By the end of 2020, what did those CDC death numbers say? Now, it wasn't 28% of the monthly dead being white. By the end of 2020, it was 55% of the monthly dead being white. And by the middle of 2021, 63% of the monthly dead, and pretty soon 60 to 65% of the total dead were in fact white, which is slightly higher than the white percentage of the population. So even though there was massive racial disparity, and when you adjust for age, there still is, affecting black and brown folks. Younger black and brown folks far more likely to die than younger white folks, for instance. But because of the disproportionate effect on older persons, and because the white community is on average older than the black community, older than the Latino community, older than the Asian Pacific American and Pacific Islander community, older than the indigenous community, it ended up disproportionately wrecking white folks too. And the only reason that happened that makes any sense is because at some point in the middle of 2020, white folks decided we didn't need to take it seriously. And all those communities that voted for Trump ended up being disproportionately affected by it, having the highest mortality rates per capita. So that's interest convergency. If we had decided that Black Lives Mattered in March and April of 2020, when those were the ones being disproportionately lost, then maybe we would have done something. But we didn't think they mattered, and now a lot of white folks buried their grandparents and their parents and their brothers and their sisters and their neighbors and their friends. And it didn't have to be that way. But that's what happens when you don't take the pain seriously because it's on that side of town. Just wait a minute, and it'll come to your side. War on drugs is the same thing. Got a lot of white folks that don't understand why we don't have rehab and treatment for fentanyl and for meth and for various forms of opiates. Why don't we have those programs? We don't have them because 30 years ago, white folks started voting for politicians that didn't want to believe in any of that stuff, just wanted to lock folks away for drugs because drugs were a moral failing. Drugs were a crime problem, not a public health problem. Who were we locking up? Black and brown folk. We had an opioid addiction problem in the early 70s. Heroin, street heroin, mostly in urban communities, disproportionately of color. Nobody cared about rehab then. They just cared about locking people away. Same thing with crack. But as soon as it became little Jimmy John down at the trailer park, right, Some white person, right, not being able to access rehab and treatment. My God, what are we doing? We're letting people die. Yeah. Imagine, right? Interest convergence. If we had thought black and brown life mattered, maybe we would have spent the money in the right place and we'd have had treatment and rehab for everybody's babies and everybody's friends and everybody's family. But we didn't. The loss of manufacturing jobs, same thing. In 2016 and 2020, had all these folks running around demanding that politicians bring the jobs back to their little small towns and the Rust Belts, right? Their semi-rural communities. Where have all the jobs gone? I don't know. Ask black people, because black folks saw them leaving in the early 80s and the mid 80s and the early 90s. And you know what we told black folks when the plant shut down and the jobs left? Y'all need to pack up and move and go where the jobs are. Pull yourselves up. Black folks didn't get to go to politicians and say, y'all need to bring the jobs back to us, and then pitch a fit when that didn't happen. No, they were just told to get in a car and move. But white folks, see, waited around, didn't care about that job loss when it was disproportionately hitting people of color, and now it's hitting us. Gun deaths, right? Same thing. My friend Jonathan Metzl, who wrote the book Dying of Whiteness, and I highly recommend you read it. He's a professor at Vanderbilt, a few minutes from where I live, and wrote a book called Dying of Whiteness where he looked at this issue. He looked at healthcare and guns and education. It was fascinating what he found. First, we talk about healthcare. On healthcare, he talks about going to a community just outside of Nashville, mostly white, and sitting in a group of white men, lower income white men, all of them living in like voucher housing, like Section 8, with housing vouchers, right? So these are all low income guys. And he's talking to this one guy who has liver disease, in horrible shape, just terrible health, but he has no health care, right? And one of the reasons he didn't have health care is because the state of Tennessee, after the ACA passed, my state in its infinite wisdom, like a lot of southern states, did not expand Medicaid to cover near poor but not quite utterly destitute people. You know, a lot of other states expanded Medicaid, but we did not, because we didn't want to support quote-unquote Obamacare, right? Now, right up the road from us in Kentucky, they did expand it. And it was working wonders in that state. You had all these people that had been uninsured who were suddenly insured. And so my friend Jonathan says, to this white guy, he's like, that's a shame you don't live an hour and a half away. Like, if you lived an hour and a half away, you could get on Obamacare, on ACA, and you'd have coverage. It might not be perfect, but, it'd be something. And he says to Jonathan, I'd rather die than be on Obamacare. That's for welfare cheats and illegal aliens, his words. That's what he says. He said, I'd rather die than get that, because it makes him associated with what? With black and brown folks. Just so happens that guy's now dead. Because he didn't get care. Again, interest convergence, see? You're so worried about somebody else getting over on you. And there's actually research on this from the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, which years ago found that the number one most highly correlated factor with opposing universal health care for everyone in this country, the number one factor, it's not being a Republican, it's not being a self-described conservative, it's not about what part of the country you live in, it's whether or not you believe black people will cheat the program. Right? That's the most highly correlated. So you got white folks that don't have health care, but they just, by God, I don't want it, because they're going to cheat. So I'll just die, right? Interest convergence, right? We got people that are cutting off their own nose to spite their face just to not get, taken advantage of by the so-called other. This isn't logical behavior. This is sick behavior. And then Jonathan also talks about guns in there. He talks about how in the state of Missouri, which historically used to have really tight gun laws up until about 2014 or so, right? 2010, 2011. But really after Ferguson, it got really easy to get a gun in Missouri, right? After the Ferguson uprising, all these white folks wanted guns because, they just figured black folks were going to come up from Florissant. They were going to come up from the middle of St. Louis. They're going to come up from Ferguson into their little lily white suburbs and exurbs and rural communities and hold people up at gunpoint, rob their farmhouse or something. I don't know. Right? So you had all these folks going and getting guns because they could. They made it easier. What happened? Did you have a lot of these folks fending off black marauding, invading gangs? No, because they weren't coming. Right? But what you did have was a massive spike in gun suicides, and guess who it was killing themselves with these guns that they hadn't had before, but that now they went and purchased. It was white men. White folks are 91% of all gun suicides in this country. White men, about 88, 89% of them. Think about that. 88 or 89% of gun suicides, not all suicides, but gun suicides, white men. And the reason that so many of those white men have guns is to protect themselves from black folks. Now, isn't that ironic? Got to protect from those people, but then all of a sudden, if you are depressed or you going through something, there are a lot of ways to end your life, right? But if you've got access to a gun, it is infinitely easier to do so. And if the only reason you went out and got that little arsenal of yours is to protect you from the so-called other, and now you've got a weapon of self-destruction right there in your cabinet, right there in your closet, right there in your bedside stand, guess what? You are far more likely to die at your own hand than you are to stop some intruder, let alone a dangerous black one from the city coming to hurt you. So there's interest convergence here. You see, we need critical race theory because critical race theory would teach us what to look for, teach us to look for these patterns, teach us to see that equity is in all of our interests. It isn't just about what we do for the so-called other, it's about what we need to do for ourselves. This system isn't really working for the vast majority of us, right? We just keep acting as though it will. It sets us up and it gives us what W.E.B. Du Bois called the psychological wage of whiteness, right? Which is the wage that says, well, you might not have much, but at least you're not black. At least you're not indigenous. At least you're not a person of color. So you're better off than somebody. And then we'll take that bargain, right? But meanwhile, the folks that really run the society and profit most handsomely from the exploitation of the vast majority of working people just keep laughing at us because we're fighting over the pieces of a pie that none of us own, or that very few of us do. So this issue about attacking critical race theory, attacking anti-racist education, it's all about trying to make sure that young people in particular don't think critically about the history they've inherited. Because the great thing about young people, right, is young people have an innate sense of fairness. And by the time you get a little older, this society will try to strangle that out of you, right? That's what it does, because now when you're trying to sweat a mortgage or you're trying to, pay your bills, pay your student loans, pay your whatever it is, right? It gets a lot harder sometimes to think about justice when you get older because you got a lot more on your plate. So they really want to make sure young people aren't thinking about it. If young people recognize the history of injustice and the inheritance of that injustice, the inertia of that history, they will go into the streets as they did in 2020. They will call for justice, right? Whether that's here, whether that's in Palestine, wherever that is, they will do that. But if you keep them from learning that history, if you keep them from engaging with that history critically, then maybe they won't. That's what they're counting on. If we can hide the truth until they're adults, they'll never try to learn it, right? If we can keep them from learning the truth until they've got all these other day-to-day concerns, then we'll never have to worry about them. That's where we are, and that's why we have to fight, and that's why we have to resist this attempt to cancel historical accuracy and honesty and push for more, not less, critical race theory in our schools and in our everyday lives. Thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate you.